Hi, welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from this lesson right here, God's Mission, My Mission. This week we're studying from lesson number 3, which has the title, God's Call to Mission, and today is Tuesday's lesson, which has the title, Abraham's Call. Now, today's lesson reflects a very vivid reality of what it means to be a missionary, and one that is often forgotten or set aside when we consider the missionaries in the Bible. You see, when we read stories in the Bible of people who went when God called, we read the whole story from beginning to end. And since we have that scope of the story, we can see the beginning, the middle, and the end. Sometimes we don't take into account the fact that these people were living in the moment. So for example, in the story of Abraham, that is the story that we read about in today's lesson, he was called at this moment in his life. He wasn't a young man anymore. He was already an older gentleman, all right? He's not leaving it with the energy of his youth anymore. He's already going in a period in his life where he had imagined very likely that he was settled down, that he knew what to expect for the rest of his life. And then he leaves, and he's being called by God. Think about it. He's being called by God. The Bible says that by faith he went, not knowing where he was going, but he knew that he was being called by God. And usually when you're called by God, you presume that God knows what he's doing, which of course he does know what he's doing. We're not presuming that God doesn't know, but you presume that, things are they're going to go smoothly. After all, God is the one that called you. And so when he encounters trials and tribulations, I'm sure that must have been very difficult to process. That wasn't the easiest thing to go through. After all, he had been called by God. Why was God now strangely silent in the middle of his problems? He was facing famine. He was surrounded by his enemies. That's what Genesis chapter 12 verse 6 says. It says that the Canaanites were in the land. So he's being called to this land where there are several people that aren't friendly to him. And then while he's there, a famine strikes. Why did God call him precisely at that time? Think about what's going in his mind in the moment. Why did the Lord call me to this dangerous land? And now there's a famine here. Didn't God know the future? Why did he bring me now? Why didn't he bring me after the famine? So you see that there are so many variables of what could have gone through Abraham's mind, so much so that he leaves that land because of the famine and he goes down into Egypt. You could read this in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, all the way to chapter 13, verse 1. And so he arrives in Egypt and he pretends that Sarah is his sister. It's a half truth or a half lie. After all, she is his half sister. We're not going to get into that, all right? Other times, different times. But in any case, that's what he says because he's scared that because she's so beautiful, he's going to be killed in order for these people there in Egypt to marry Sarah, or for Pharaoh to marry Sarah. And so here he comes to a compromise on his principles. He compromises the truth in order to, in his mind, survive. It sounds to me here that Abraham is going through survival mode, right? I don't know if you've ever gone through something like that, but when you go through these moments where you're just trying to survive, one difficulty after another, one challenge after another, you're just trying to keep your head above the waters. You're trying to survive. I've been through moments like that myself where really I'm just trying to survive. I'm trying to keep my head above the waters. And so Abraham here, he compromises his morals, his values, his principles. He compromises truth in order to survive. That's not a justification. You should never compromise on truth. But that's what happens here. And what that tells me is that God is extremely patient with his servants. God is extremely patient with those that he sends. Abraham here, he's in the thick of the battle. He's in the moment. He doesn't know the end of his story. He doesn't know what comes next. For all he knows, he might die the next day, the next year, the next week. After all, even though God had promised a lineage through Abraham, when you're in the moment, when you're going through the thick of the battle, sometimes the darkness of your environment, the darkness of your circumstances, they make you forget the promises that God had previously made. This actually happens a few times with Abraham. You remember the story with Ishmael, where apparently to him, the Lord had delayed the promise that he would have a son. And so in order to help God, or in his mind, help God, he has a child with his wife's servant, with Hagar. And then he has Ishmael, and that leads to a world of problems. Really, we see Abraham in a few key moments in his life, he goes through the valley of doubt, the valley of God's silence. And I'll tell you, that's somewhat comforting to me. And it might sound strange to say, well, this man is going through a bunch of problems and that's comforting to you. It's comforting in the sense that sometimes we look at these giants of the Bible, Abraham, Moses, David, and we think that, wow, these people, look at what they did. Look at who they were. And how can I ever measure up to them? How can I be like them? Well, when you get into their story, you see that they also went through hardships. They also went through moments of doubt, especially after answering God's call to mission. Moses, it happened to him. David, it happened to him. Abraham here, it happens to him. After God calls, after they answer the call, they go out into the mission, they do go through moments of doubt. They go through moments of worry. They go through moments of anxiety. And I'll tell you, friends, that's what's comforting to me, because I go through the same thing. There are moments when I'm so anxious, when I do get worried, when I do have my doubts, and that's after I believe that I answered God's call. And so in this story, I find it so relieving, so comforting that I'm not alone in this, that the giants of the Bible, they also went through these things. Now, again, I'm not justifying compromising the morals, lowering the standard of truth because of the doubts, because of the anxieties, but the truth is that we're going to stumble sometimes. We're going to make mistakes. It's through and through throughout the Bible. The only one that never did that was Jesus Christ. Everyone else, I'm sure they had their doubts. They had their trials. Don't you think that Joseph, in the prison, he was wondering, Lord, what was that dream that I had so long ago where you said that something was going to happen where I was going to lead? What happened? Don't you think that Daniel had his moments of doubt when he's being led into captivity? All of these people, even the giants, they had their moments. Even Christ in the Gethsemane, he said, my God, if possible, remove this cup from me. But in Jesus Christ, you see something that is unique. Jesus, even in his greatest moment of weakness, in the most critical moment, he was able to surrender his entire will to the Lord and say, but Lord, not what I desire, but what you desire. Not what I want, but you want. And so here you have a great example of someone under the stress, under the burden, under the weight of the pressure of doubt and anxiety. After all, Jesus, he sweat drops of blood. So you can't say that that's a walk in the park. But that's a great example of Christ, of this is God made flesh. But for everyone else, I mean, they had problems. They doubted, they tripped up, they stumbled. Some of them fell. This happened with Abraham, it happens with Moses, happens with David, happens with these giants. So that tells us, friends, that we're not alone in this, okay? That when you do trip, when you make a mistake, when you, in hindsight, see that, yep, I could have done better, I shouldn't have compromised this, I shouldn't have lowered the standards, you see that God doesn't abandon his servants at that moment. He continues to encourage them, he continues to protect them. That's what he did here with Abraham, even though he had done what he did here in chapter 12. Look at what the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 130, has to say about this moment in Abraham's life. It says, during his stay in Egypt, Abraham gave evidence that he was not free from human weakness and imperfection. In concealing the fact that Sarah was his wife, he betrayed a trust of the divine care, a lack of that lofty faith and courage so often and nobly exemplified in his life. Through Abraham's lack of faith, Sarah was placed in great peril. The king of Egypt became informed of her beauty, caused her to be taken to his palace, intending to make her his wife. But the Lord in his great mercy protected Sarah by sending judgments upon the royal household. Again, that's in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 130. The key word here is mercy. This has nothing to do with what Abraham deserved, with what Sarah deserved. After all, they were here compromising on their truthfulness. But God, in his mercy, protected his servant. And we can count on the same divine protection and mercy. You know, the Bible says that God is many things. God is powerful. God is great. God is just. However, the Bible says that God delights in mercy. That's the only attribute that the Bible mentions that he delights in, that he loves to be. God delights in mercy. Again, not saying that God does everything else begrudgingly, but it's interesting that the Bible mentions this about mercy. He delights in mercy. And so I hope that you study this lesson today. There's so much to be learned, so much to be thought. This is one of those lessons that you study and you spend the day thinking about, because it is truly something that we can relate to as missionaries, as Christians. The fact that we are called by God, but we still live in a world where God is sometimes silent, and we have to process that silence. Some of the greatest lessons of life are learned during God's silence. After all, God's silence speaks volumes sometimes. In any case, study your lesson. Not only study it, but look up the Bible verses that are mentioned here. Think about what you're reading, meditate on it throughout the day, and I'm sure that it's going to be a moment of growth for you. Please comment down below with any questions or any comments. I'd love to interact with you. Also, please remember to like, to share, and to subscribe to our videos. We release one every day, and I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another Sabbath School Daily.